Look into a mirror right now. Or better yet, look at the eyes of someone sitting near you. Because in the next few minutes, I'm going to tell you something that might make you question everything you think you know about where you came from. If you have blue eyes, green eyes, or even certain shades of hazel, scientists have traced that trait back to a single human being who lived thousands of years ago. And the story of how we found that person is stranger than fiction. This isn't a myth. This isn't 23andMe marketing copy. This is real genetics, real archaeology, and a real mystery that took decades to crack. So stay with me, because by the end of this video, you're going to look at your own eyes, or your kid's eyes, or your partner's eyes, completely differently. Let's start with a fact that sounds almost too strange to be true. Every single blue-eyed person alive on Earth today, all 800 million to a billion of them, shares one common ancestor. Not a population, not a tribe, one person. This isn't speculation. It's the conclusion of a landmark study led by Professor Hans Eiberg at the University of Copenhagen, published back in 2008, after his team spent years sequencing DNA from blue-eyed people across Denmark, Turkey, and Jordan. What they found broke the assumptions scientists had held for a long time. Here's the background you need. Originally, every human being on the planet had brown eyes. That's not opinion. That's what the genetic and fossil evidence tells us. Brown is the ancestral default human eye color, controlled by a gene called OCA2, which manages how much melanin gets produced in the iris. More melanin, darker eyes. This was true for every human being for the majority of our species' existence, stretching back over 150,000 years. Then, somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, which, in evolutionary terms, is basically yesterday, something unusual happened. A mutation occurred in a neighboring gene called HERC2. This mutation didn't destroy the OCA2 gene. Instead, it acted like a dimmer switch, throttling down how much melanin the iris could produce. The result wasn't the complete absence of pigment. It was just enough of a reduction that the iris took on a blue appearance. The same way the sky looks blue, not because it contains blue pigment, but because of how light scatters. And here's the part that should give you chills. Eiberg's team found that every blue-eyed person they tested, regardless of whether they were from Denmark, from the Middle East, or anywhere else, carried the exact same genetic mutation, the exact same sequence, in the exact same spot. If blue eyes had evolved multiple times independently in different populations, you'd expect to see different mutations doing similar things. But that's not what they found. They found the identical genetic fingerprint, which means it only happened once in one person, and every blue-eyed human since then inherited it from that single ancestor. Now, pause on that for a second. Somewhere near the Black Sea region, where researchers believe this mutation most likely originated, there was a person, roughly 10,000 years ago, who was born with a genetic accident. And that accident spread, not because blue eyes gave any survival advantage, there's actually no strong evidence they did, but simply because of migration, mixing in time. That person has millions of descendants walking around today who have no idea they're all distantly related through a genetic fluke that happened at the dawn of agriculture. But this is where the story takes its first real twist, because knowing that blue eyes trace back to one mutation is only half the puzzle. The real question that scientists have been fighting over for the last decade is this: what did that ancestor, and the early blue-eyed populations after them, actually look like? And the answer archaeology gave us in 2018 shattered a lot of assumptions people had been carrying for generations. In 1903, in a limestone cave in Somerset, England, called Gough's Cave, workers discovered the nearly complete skeleton of a man who had died roughly 10,000 years ago. He became known as Cheddar Man, the oldest, nearly complete human skeleton ever found in Britain. For over a century, people assumed he probably looked like a typical modern Brit, pale-skinned, maybe light hair. It was just assumed because that's what people in Britain look like today, right? Ancestors resemble descendants. Simple logic. Except in 2018, scientists at London's Natural History Museum extracted DNA from Cheddar Man's inner ear bone and ran a full genomic analysis. What they found made international headlines and honestly upset quite a few people online. Cheddar Man, this ancient Brit, this early ancestor of people living in the United Kingdom today, had genetic markers strongly associated with dark to black skin. And his eyes? Blue, piercingly blue. Sit with that combination for a second, because it directly contradicts the assumption most people carry without even realizing it. The assumption that light skin and light eyes have always traveled together, that there's some kind of evolutionary package deal. Cheddar Man proves that's false. Dark skin and blue eyes coexisted in the same human being in ancient Britain, thousands of years before lighter skin tones became widespread across Europe. Dr. Tom Booth, one of the researchers on the project, explained that Cheddar Man's genome had more in common, skin-wise, with populations in sub-Saharan Africa than with modern Europeans, while his eye color mutation matched what we'd call textbook blue. So how does that happen? How do you get dark skin and blue eyes in the same ancient population? The answer lies in something scientists call mosaic evolution. Different traits evolving on different timelines, spreading through populations at different speeds for different reasons. Skin pigmentation in Europe lightened gradually over thousands of years, likely tied to diets low in vitamin D and reduced sunlight at higher latitudes, favoring people who could synthesize vitamin D more efficiently through paler skin. But the mutation for blue eyes had already appeared and was already spreading independently on its own timeline, unrelated to the skin lightening process. These two traits weren't a package. They were two separate genetic stories that happened to be unfolding in the same region, in the same era, sometimes in the very same person. Now here's where I need you to really lean in, because this next part connects everything together and explains why this topic keeps resurfacing in genetic circles and keeps sparking arguments among archaeologists. If Cheddar Man had dark skin and blue eyes, and if all blue eyes trace back to that one ancestor near the Black Sea, that means the earliest blue-eyed humans in Europe did not look like the stereotype of a fair-skinned, light-haired Northern European that pop culture, and honestly, a lot of outdated 20th century anthropology, had painted for over 100 years. The Nordic look, the image so many people associate with deep, ancient European ancestry, is actually a relatively recent development in the timeline of human history, genetically recent. We're talking about changes that were still actively happening as recently as 3,000 to 5,000 years ago, well within the era of written history in other parts of the world. Before you keep watching, if this is blowing your mind even a little, and I know it is, hit subscribe now, because this channel is about to get into an even deeper mystery involving ancient migration, mixed ancestry, and how eye color connects to population movements that most textbooks never even mention. You do not want to miss what's coming. Okay, let's keep going, because blue eyes aren't the only piece of this puzzle. There's an even stranger story hiding in green eyes, and in a population most people have never even heard of. Green eyes are actually rarer than blue eyes globally. They show up in roughly 2% of the world's population. Unlike blue eyes, which come from a reduction of melanin, green eyes involve a slightly different genetic combination. A moderate amount of melanin combined with something called Rayleigh scattering, the same optical phenomenon that makes the sky blue, layered on top of a small amount of yellowish pigment called lipochrome. It's essentially a genetic cocktail, and it requires a more specific combination of gene variants to occur, which is part of why it's rarer. Here's where it gets interesting from an ancestry standpoint. Green eyes show up at unusually high concentrations in specific, surprising pockets of the world, places that don't fit the assumptions people usually make. One of the highest concentrations of green eyes on the planet isn't in Ireland or Scotland, like most people would guess. It's actually found among certain populations in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and parts of Central Asia, along the ancient Silk Road corridor. And this connects to one of the most famous photographs in modern history. In 1984, National Geographic photographer Steve McCurry took a portrait of a young Afghan refugee girl in a camp in Pakistan. Her piercing green eyes, framed by a red headscarf, became one of the most recognized images ever published, known simply as Afghan Girl. For years, people speculated about her ancestry, some assuming foreign or European lineage must be involved somewhere in her family tree, because green eyes felt, to a lot of viewers, like they belonged somewhere else. But when National Geographic tracked her down again in 2002, her name is Sharbat Gula, and they confirmed her identity using iris recognition technology, matching the unique pattern of her eyes. Geneticists and anthropologists pointed out that green eyes have deep indigenous roots throughout Central and South Asia, tied to ancient Indo-Iranian and Pashtun populations who had never left the region. Her eyes weren't evidence of some outside bloodline. They were evidence of just how old and how genetically diverse populations along the ancient trade routes of Central Asia really are. roots that connected cultures for thousands of years before Europe, as we think of it, even existed. This is a pattern that shows up again and again once you start digging. Light eye colors get culturally coded as belonging to one region, when the genetic reality tells a much older, much messier, much more interesting story about migration and mixing. There's a fourth eye color hiding in this story too, and it's the rarest of them all: gray. Less than 3% of people worldwide have it, even rarer than green. Gray eyes come from an even lower concentration of melanin than blue eyes, combined with a slightly different density in the collagen fibers of the iris itself, which scatters light in a way that reads as silver or slate instead of sky blue. Researchers studying eye color genetics, including a widely cited 2011 study out of Rotterdam's Erasmus University, found that gray eyes involve subtle variations near that same OCA2 and HERC2 region responsible for blue eyes, just expressed slightly differently. Where do gray eyes show up most? Overwhelmingly in the Baltic region. Countries like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania report some of the highest rates of gray and light eyes on the planet. Geneticists connect this concentration to isolated hunter-gatherer populations who lived around the Baltic Sea for thousands of years, with less mixing from the farming and steppe migrations that reshaped the rest of Europe. In other words, gray eyes may be one of the closest living links we have to Europe's original hunter-gatherer population, largely undiluted by the waves of migration that changed everyone else. And that brings us to one of the most contested archaeological debates connected to all of this: the story of the Tarim Basin mummies. In the Xinjiang region of far western China, in one of the driest deserts on Earth, archaeologists uncovered dozens of naturally mummified bodies, some dating back over 3,800 years. What shocked researchers when they were first properly studied in the 1990s wasn't just how well preserved they were, it was their physical features. Some of the mummies had reddish or light brown hair. Some genetic and physical analyses suggested lighter eye pigmentation. For decades, this sparked heated arguments among archaeologists and, unfortunately, got pulled into some ugly political debates about who really belonged in that region historically. But here's what a major genomic study published in Nature in 2021 actually found. After finally sequencing the mummies' full genomes, the Tarim Basin mummies weren't recent migrants from Europe or the West, as some earlier, less rigorous theories had assumed. They were genetically distinct, deeply local, descended from an ancient population known as the ancient North Eurasians, a genetic lineage that also contributed ancestry to populations across Siberia, into the Americas, and yes, into parts of Europe. In other words, these light-featured ancient mummies in the middle of China and the ancestors of people you might think of as classically Nordic or European both trace back in part to the same deep, shared source population, one that lived long before the modern racial and ethnic categories we use today ever existed. That ancient North Eurasian lineage is honestly one of the most fascinating threads in modern population genetics, and it ties directly back to eye color. This lineage is best represented by the genome of a young boy who died around 24,000 years ago, near Malta in Siberia. His remains, studied and published by a team led by geneticist Eske Willerslev in 2013, revealed genetic markers linked to lighter eye pigmentation, and astonishingly, genetic contributions to both Native American populations and, separately, to European populations thousands of years later. That means a lineage from deep Siberia, tens of thousands of years old, quietly threads its way into the ancestry of people on completely different continents, showing up in eye color variations that persist today. So when someone tells you that a certain eye color belongs to a certain nationality or a certain ethnicity, or proves a certain heritage, the actual archaeological and genetic record tells a far messier, far more human story. Populations moved constantly. They mixed constantly. Traits like eye color spread along trade routes, through conquest, through migration, through simple human curiosity and connection, thousands of years before anyone had the concept of a nation or a modern ethnic identity to assign that trait to. There's one more piece of this that I think you'll find just as unsettling in the best way. Remember how we said the blue eye mutation likely originated near the Black Sea? Geneticists have connected this region, in this general era, to a broader population shift studied extensively by researcher David Reich and his team at Harvard. The spread of what are called the Yamnaya, a group of pastoralist herders from the Pontic steppe, whose massive migrations roughly 5,000 years ago reshaped the genetic map of Europe and parts of Asia almost entirely. Ancient DNA studies published throughout the 2010s showed that the Yamnaya migrations replaced huge portions of the existing gene pool in Europe within just a few generations, an almost total genetic turnover in some regions. If you have European ancestry today, there is a very strong chance that a significant portion of your DNA doesn't trace back to the earliest farmers or hunter-gatherers of that land at all, but to these steppe migrants who swept in from what is now Ukraine and southern Russia, which means that eye color, skin tone, and the physical traits we associate today with entire nations and ethnicities were, genetically speaking, still being shuffled, mixed, replaced, and redistributed as recently as a few thousand years ago. Not tens of thousands. Not since the dawn of time, like a lot of people casually assume. A few thousand years, that's a blink in evolutionary terms. So here's what all of this actually means for you. Sitting there watching this, maybe with brown eyes, maybe with blue, maybe with green or hazel or something in between. Your eye color is not a stamp confirming some clean, single origin story about where your ancestors came from. It's the visible tip of an incredibly complicated genetic history, one involving a single mutation from a person near the Black Sea 10,000 years ago, a dark-skinned, blue-eyed man in ancient Britain who shattered assumptions the moment his DNA was sequenced, a green-eyed girl in Afghanistan whose photograph the whole world recognized before anyone actually understood her ancestry, mummies in a Chinese desert connected to Siberian hunters from 24,000 years ago, and massive migrations that reshuffled entire continents' worth of DNA within a handful of generations. The truth is, nobody's ancestry is as simple, as pure, or as tidy as our assumptions make it out to be. Every eye color you see in the mirror, or across a dinner table, or on a crowded street, carries inside it thousands of years of movement, mixing, mutation, and migration that most of us were never taught in school. If this changed the way you think about something as simple as eye color, imagine what else you don't know about where you actually come from. That's exactly what this channel digs into. The real science and real archaeology behind the human story, minus the myths. So if you don't want to miss the next one, go ahead and subscribe right now before you close this tab, because trust me, the next story is even wilder than this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.